Oh, wow, that is way different. All right, well, I assume you guys can hear me now. So I'm actually going to be talking about managing remote data in managing your remote data flow in React Native. I'll get into that, what that means. But out of show of hands, anybody using React Native at all? Cool, so we had a handful of us actually using it. I think it's actually more than the last meetup I went to, which is awesome. So talk about React Native, but before I get into React Native, I like to try to loop people through a story. And if you guys have ever seen me talk before, I tend to talk about Kanye West. Anybody familiar with Kanye West? I gave a different talk in Chicago last month, and obviously everybody knew who Kanye West was there. So yeah, it doesn't matter what city because he's a god. Well, he used to be. He's fallen from grace recently. But anyway, so Kanye West came out in 2004. He kind of changed the game for rap. At the time, this was like my senior year in high school. I'm going to date myself. I'm like 30 years old last year. And he made it okay for, at the time in 2004, we were coming out of the do-rag age of rap. I don't know if you guys remember this, if you guys were in the rap at that time. Maybe you guys are late bloomers. You guys like rap now. It's quite different than it was 10 years ago. And yeah, so that was par for the course to get a Grammy in a do-rag, which is awkward. So Kanye West came on the game. He changed the way rap was, how you actually what you rap about. You no longer had to be a gangster. You could actually like rap about your life, which was great. I know he's quite different now today, but this is what he changed. He made it okay for black males to wear the pants at their waist, which was awesome for me because my grandma bought my clothes back then, and I fit right in, so it was awesome. And just even a year later, 50 Cent, who was pretty much the king of rap at that moment, he became pretty quickly irrelevant. I know this year he actually had one of his biggest albums, which included The Candy Shop. But you guys listen to 50 Cent now? Anybody? You like his latest album? His latest movie? No? Okay, exactly. So Kanye West basically ruined his career. So what I'm getting at is React Native basically changed the game for making mobile apps. Changed the mobile game is what I specifically said. So at the time, I got into React Native about 6 months after it started. Before that, when React Native came out, I got into Objective-C because I wanted to make iOS apps. Everybody knows what came after Objective-C, which was Swift. Came out very shortly after React Native. But because of React Native, making mobile apps got really, like learning Objective-C became pretty irrelevant. Swift kind of did that for them, but even more so with React Native. Like, what's the point of deep diving into Objective-C? A lot of companies are still using Objective-C. I think Walmart, you guys might have Objective-C code out there. So there's still kind of a need to learn it. And React Native, you still have to know what the native code is doing when you get down and dirty with the code. But what's nice is that you don't have to learn what's going on there for a long time. So React Native's main concern, make great mobile apps in JavaScript. That's basically all it is. It's nice to have a team, and as you mentioned for your team, be able to have like web developers actually contribute to your iOS app or your Android app. Or I talked to one of the Blue Jeans guys who's actually using React Native Windows, which is awesome that you can pull in other people from other teams that contribute to something on internally in your app. So I'm actually talking about data management, and the nice thing about React Native is it takes the abstraction of trying to get your iOS app working, and this even approaching it as a web developer, because a lot of our sites, a lot of our startups, we start with a web app, and then we want to move to mobile. I think that's kind of the trend. I don't know if anybody goes mobile first these days, but it's easier. It's easier to start with web because there's a lot more web developers than there are mobile developers. So again, talking about data management, and I can't talk about data management without Flux. Flux is like the first implementation of, the first idea of how to manage your data flow in React. Does anybody know what Flux is? Do I have to explain it? Okay, well, this kind of sums it up. So Facebook notifications, they had a problem where every time they would go on the mobile side, they would mark a notification red, and then you go to the website, the notification was still unread, so it would just flop back and forth. They couldn't manage the state between notifications for your Messenger client is specifically what the problem was. There's a really good talk that came out in ReactConf a couple years ago, and they kind of explain their issue. It's like literally embedded in the React documentation. So if you can't find it next to the Flux section, well, you should probably read the documentation harder. Cool, and then I can't talk about React without talking about, I can't talk about Flux without talking about Redux. And Redux is It's something I'm actually not going to put too much time. Anybody use Redux out there? Show of hands, cool. You guys probably use React for the web, or React for the web. Regular React, you probably use Redux. It's almost like the gold standard for data flow. I tend not to talk about this because, at least not in this talk, because I feel like a lot of people have already gone over that hurdle. And I feel like people go to this too quickly before they actually approach other options. And so I'm actually going to talk about the other options today. But in summary, Redux is a predictable state container for your JavaScript apps, so you can manage your state across your entire app in a Redux store. You guys follow me yet? Cool. So React Native changed the game, brought us new ideas, just like Flux. So TLDR, what am I going to talk about? I'm going to talk about set state, which is actually, I was going to ask you guys if you know any other alternatives of managing data flow, so I skipped that part, but these are alternatives. So set state, you guys familiar with set state at all in React? Only a couple hands? That hurts. It hurts a lot. Set state, it really should be the first thing you go for when you build your React app. Like if you're prototyping an app, I'll show you what kind of app I'm talking about.
Okay.
I would say go for this for the app I'm about to talk about. I think Redux is pretty heavy-handed, especially if you're just trying something out. Now, if you're committing to make this your thing, go with Redux. Redux is the way to go. We use Redux at the company I work for. We use Redux at the company I used to work for. Redux is the way to go. But why no Redux? Because sometimes it's just not ready, and this is what I was getting at. So I'll answer this question, why no Redux? But first I want to talk about something that I love talking about. It's my favorite subject, which is myself. So that's what I look like on the internet. That's my Twitter handle. I do want to mention all these slides is in a small URL that you can't even see from back there. It's yeezus.netlify.com, so if you want to follow along at home, it's yeezus.netlify.com, and then you can see the slides. That's my Twitter handle. I got started in React Native, and I gave a talk actually a year ago, probably this week, at 4JS. I talked about my experience learning Objective-C, then learning Swift, and then finally doing React Native, and I compared all of them. So FYI, just check that out if you want to. It's on my website, which is also labeled in my description on my Twitter handle. So what I'm getting at is I work for a company called Netlify, and Netlify, we are a Git-centric workflow for hosting front-end focused websites, static websites with asterisk. Not so much static because they're hyper-dynamic because you can inject JavaScript in it and have other stuff happen. So we try to get away from the term static because people get really confused when we say static. They're like, why don't I just run a machine in my house and I can have my static site run? Why do I need to pay you money? Well, because you have more than just static happening in your app. So we coined the term Jamstack, which is JavaScript, APIs, and markup. So if you're using those three things in your front-end focused app, then you could probably host with us. I was hired at Netlify to convert their Angular code to React. That was like my first thing. Now I do other random things. And this is what Netlify looks like. So it's just like their UI dashboard. And this guy, you asked, like, we don't really have a huge mobile use case for our app because a lot of it's a developer tool. And a lot of developers, 99.5% of our developers that use us on the web. Like not I think the 0.5%, it's not 99, but the only percentage that we actually get people using it is when they read our blog. So that's like the only mobile use case. So that doesn't look like a blog. This is what it looks like in mobile. So I just literally just opened up the dev tools in Chrome and screenshotted what it looks like in mobile. Responsive, whatever, it's all great, modern web. And this is what I was trying to get to. So this is actually what I built. It's not a prototype anymore, but it's I actually got approved to do this talk 2 weeks ago. And 2 weeks ago, I decided to make a mobile app for Netlify. So this is as far as I got because I only spent one night on it. So hopefully down the road, if you follow me on Twitter, I'll actually unveil this on iOS and Android eventually. But that's what I'm getting at. And what was really nice is that Netlify we're a developer tool. We have an API that you can access through our CLI tool. You can access through other third-party libraries that other people have built for us or built for themselves and put out for the community. So we already have an API that has data in it. So if you wanted to see every site that you have in a mobile app, like we have access to that, which was nice. So that's what I'm getting at. This talks about data flow. I know there's a long intro with some Kanye references, but this is like the meat of the talk's actually coming up most soon. So take a sip of your beer and hold on to your butts. So to answer the question, like why not Redux? Like at Netlify, we use Redux, and actually the reason why I only spent one night on this app is because I spent most of the time trying to get Redux to work in my React Native app, and it's because we have tons of Redux actions, Redux reducers, and to copy and paste those into my React Native app to show one site was kind of an overkill. It just made no sense. Why am I using Redux for this? So I actually approached it completely different, which I'll get into in a second. Some other things too in our Redux actions, since it's a web-based client and we never had a use case for mobile, some of the things we're doing with our API and stashing tokens and stuff like that, we're using local storage, not for tokens, but for other things like who signs up. You can actually build a site without signing up, so we use local storage for that. There's other routing. We use React Router Redux, which is a pain to transfer. There's a React Native router Redux or whatever, which is god awful. So routing is a problem. I don't know. Has anybody ever done routing in React Native? It's changing very frequently. There's a new React navigation that came out like weeks ago that I actually started implementing in this app, but I don't have it to show because this is a data talk and not a routing talk. But yeah, there's a couple things that just did not transfer with just copying and pasting my entire folder structure of actions and reducers. And those are our actions. That's all of them. I think we have like the same amount of reducers. So there's like no reason for me to try to do Redux for this. And I to answer your all the skeptics out there, like just use Redux. Redux is the way to go. Like all I want is a prototype. I just want to make sure, I want to show my boss that we can make a mobile app, and I just want to prototype it and say, okay, let's actually put some talent and some code behind this. So that's the answer for no Redux. So going back to the different other options, React Native really, in a nutshell, and I think even Redux, which I'll get into in a bit, it's all about props and state. Like state is your internal state of your component, and then props is everything you pass in. We're about maybe 75% of your app. You could probably get away with just doing this if you really wanted to. There's probably there's use cases of why you probably don't want to go this way, which I did the React.js training guys, the React Router guys do a training course, and I did the advanced version, and they talk about this, and we build a lot of apps with just using props and state, and we go through all the use cases, and for most of the time, you could actually just get away with just using props and state, especially for tutorial apps, prototype apps, single feature apps, which is all the apps I really build. Like I don't think I have a single app where I've actually used Redux and React Native yet. This would have been my first attempt, but I failed miserably. So since we already have a REST API, all we have to do is take that REST API from Netlify and then pipe that into our React Native app, which I'm going to show you real quick on that slide. So this is like my API.js. It sits in lib. This is where I fetch my sites. Can you guys see that back there for the most part? Basically, all you're looking at is just a function. And that URL there is it just comes straight from our docs. You hit like the / api.netlify.com / API-v1, whatever, /sites. Then you get all your sites. It's all magic. It's great. The nice thing about this is that this data returns JSON, and that JSON I can put into my React Native app. Just a quick thing to point out, I'm using Axios. I tend to always use Axios whenever I fetch instead of using regular fetch. It's nicer, especially when you're expecting JSON, because everything's just like already there for you. You don't have to call .json parens, which is nice. So I'm going to talk about set state real quick. I'll go to the other two options soon. And this is basically it right here. So in my component amount, I call my fetch sites function, and then I just go ahead and just set state. So I already have it at the null value for data. I think actually I'm calling it sites here. And I'm setting state. And then from that, I can just directly go to populating my app. This kind of makes sense, pretty straightforward. For those of you guys that have never used set state ever because you jumped on a team that was already using Redux. Yeah, it's pretty straightforward. And I'm able to actually just take that and take that state and then populate my data. So let's talk about the pros. Pros for set state. It's easy to implement. It's there. It's like native. It's part of the using component mount and aside with it. It's part of like the native lifecycle API, which is great. There's nothing you have to include to do other than Axios is whatever I included. So Some of the cons on set state is every time you call set state, it re-renders the actual component. So it could be a con or it could be a pro. It depends on how you set up your app. Since I'm setting state and component mount, it makes sense to re-render because it's actually, just kidding. Component mount actually does not re-render when you call set state. And I have a link to a Stack Overflow question that coming later. It also is harder to test set state. Has anybody ever tested set state and component mount and all that stuff?
It's asynchronous.
It's asynchronous. Yeah, so there's some extra stuff you have to do to make sure that your test is actually running. So I usually just avoid, if I'm doing a quick app, I usually just don't even test that altogether because I tend to fall with the other ones. Just real quick, I just want to mention, in case people are confused, why I have components called wrapper. It's because I'm using style components. Style components is a CSS library to style your components, I guess. It's pretty new. The nice thing is that I can transfer all my CSS code from React to React Native. Styled components? Yeah. And then to answer that question, the question that I answered about setting state and setting component and mount, there's a Stack Overflow question when I was researching this talk. Should I use component will mount or component did mount? Dan Abramoff actually answers it, which is this dude is pretty awesome. Just hounding Stack Overflow, answering questions, is underhand pitches to him. So he answers it, and basically, there's your answer. Slides are online. So let's talk about testing that, which I kind of already talked about it a little bit, but some other problems that you have to mock out Axios, you got to stub data. There is a scary render DOM component with class that you use to do that, which is, I've actually never tested it in React Native. I've had issues with stuff that uses the React DOM. So I always avoid stuff like that. And all the apps I've done so far have been business heavy apps. Basically the business is not going to fail or succeed based on the apps I write for these companies that I work for. So they're all internal side projects at this point. I'm hoping this app I've kind of thrown together in the last 2 weeks actually becomes a real thing. So I tend to avoid testing that because I usually go with a higher order component. You guys remember higher order components? Cool. One of the biggest ones that my intro to higher order components is map state to props, which is a React Redux specific one. Basically what it does is does anybody want to guess what it does?
Copies over state to prop.
Yeah, that's it. It literally maps state to props. That's what it does, which is awesome. And that's what most higher order components do, is they take whatever you want it to do and throw it to props. And that's what a lot of things I'll be talking about in a sec. So there's your answer. There's a tweet of the React Training JS guys. They actually build Redux from scratch, and you re-implement map state to props, which is very straightforward. So props to React Redux for that. So testing. So basically, literally, my sites component, I can test it now with this sort of similar logic. I use Enzyme for most of my component testing, and I have some sites, I pass it in its props, and I expect the component to work. And that's my extent of, I don't know if you guys are super nitty-gritty about how you test your components. Again, these are mostly side projects, so I don't really get too detailed unless I have other functions that are inside of my component that are doing other business logic, then I'll test those. But I usually just test to make sure that works. And just to point out, if you guys can see in the back, I'm passing in props there.
Is that a testing framework?
Enzyme?
Yes.
Yeah, it's a library to give you I always go to Capybara esque API calls. Right. If you guys don't know Capybara, it's like a BDD framework to test Rails apps. So Enzyme's a lot similar to that, and it gives you a kind of a DOM interaction field. So you see all your nodes, and you can check to see if you have props or if you have children. And you can literally
inspect the DOM. You should inspect the DOM after you.
Yeah, except in React Native you don't have a DOM. It's node things. So I'm going to talk about the second thing that I have on the list that I skimmed by, which is React Transmit. I'm going to go off a limb and guess no one's ever heard of this library. Oh, you have? Sweet, because you've probably been doing React for a while, right? Yeah. So this library came out. It was on Hacker News for a bit. It was a really cool way to use Relay-esque well, Relay-inspired library based on promises instead of GraphQL. You guys heard of GraphQL? Makes sense. At least here in the Bay Area, we've heard of it. So what that looks like is this. So I've got my higher order component, which I actually had there was a really good talk at the last React SF meetup. Higher order component's a really bad name. A better name is enhanced component because you're enhancing your component. It's not really doing what higher order component or higher order functions really do, but you're actually literally just enhancing components. So normally with Relay, which I'll show you in a sec, is you have a higher order component that actually passes different data. This is actually using the fetch site function from my API, and I'm populating the props directly. So instead of setting state and using component mount, when the actual component loads, it actually fetches this data and then passes the return data to props. And I guess up there I'm just showing you, before I had this.state, now I have this.props instead. So I'm directly going to props to actually do that. Again, this is better for testing. When I'm actually passing stuff to props, I don't have to trigger some sort of mock with Axios or with my component mount to make this work. And then that's what it looks like. Again, that's a prop, if you guys aren't familiar. And this makes testing easier. So I'm going to talk to the pros. One, it's easier to test. Component-specific data fetching. This is really great for React Native, especially native apps or React Native apps that have like just a couple different routes. So my app, I didn't really get into too much detail, but we have sites and you can build sites. So whenever you deploy to master on GitHub, we'll start building your site. And the nice thing is, hopefully this app is that you can look on your phone and say, okay, notification, deploy happened, and then watch the build log happen, like to see it go down. So I'm probably gonna have like 2 routes. That's probably the max I'll have. You see your sites, then you see your deploys, and that's about it. And that's perfect because all I need to do is fetch my sites, and then once I have my site, I pass that to the next, I pass it through props to the next route, which would be deploys eventually, and then it starts fetching the deploy log, and then it just continues to trigger. So yeah, and then the only there are probably a couple other downsides, but I'm kind of tainted because I've been using this project since the beginning, so I like it. One downside is there's no unified data store, so if you need something that doesn't actually fall in the hierarchy of your props and your components, then you don't have that. You don't have like a Redux style store. It's also, unfortunately, within the last couple of months, this project's kind of waned on contributions. Rick Wong is the head maintainer, the only contributor to this project. I've opened so many issues and I have a pull request, and it's like, no, he's not merged it. So unfortunately, Rick, I won't go there. Anyway, unfortunately, this is not so much community support with this project. So I can't, at the time of me doing this talk, or setting up this talk, I would have said, yes, go ahead and use this, but I can't really say use it in an app that you have to rely upon unless something changes, or unless I fork it and make a new project and it goes on Hacker News and you guys follow me. But that probably won't happen. So I'm going to talk about the third thing, which includes, they're both a combination. I was going to talk about Relay and Apollo, but they both use GraphQL, which you guys raise your hands and say what GraphQL is. So that's what GraphQL looks like. So instead of calling a function like fetch your data, you call a query to your GraphQL URL. So most likely you've already gone to your database or your backend and you've added GraphQL endpoints to make it GraphQL ready and follow with the spec. These are, as far as I know, these are the only 2 options you have for GraphQL if you want to use a client side. It does return JSON, which is not as useful. It kind of doesn't really give you everything you can use, all the dynamic-esque GraphQL things. So if you want to use some sort of client-side system or a library, Relay and Apollo are the only ones. My recommendation, which is to learn Relay, is to check out learnrelay.org. It's a pretty cool tutorial to give you the basics. You build like a Pokemon app, and it gives you like, it's like a seven chapter tutorial or a 7-step tutorial, and you walk away for a Relay app. Pretty trivial. Relay, all you have to do is import Relay from npm, and you just inject your GraphQL URL into like your index.js or your index.ios.js. I only do iOS apps at this point. I've only done one Android app until now. I have an iOS phone, so I'm gonna test on iOS first until someone tells me to make it Android, which has only happened once, which is why I only have one Android app. So that's what it looks like. Now that you have Relay, you can actually just create container from Relay. Create container is very familiar to React Transmit. So if you guys remember, if you're paying attention while I was mumbling through it, you basically follow the same structure. You have fragments. You don't have initial variables, which is a weird part of React Transmit. And then you call relay.the query language, and you pass in your query directly. And then that's going to populate your props. So my props are now, this is actually, I do want to preface, I started the Netlify app 2 weeks ago, so I don't have a Relay example, most likely because I'm not going to use Relay for the project. So this is another project where you can go to the app and it tells you what senator and House representative you have, and it gives them the contact information. So that's the gist of the app. So if you're confused on why this data looks completely different, that's why. But literally, I can actually use the queries to actually query for the first 52 states. There's only 52 senators, and if I wanted to pass that in. Yeah, anyway, look at the documentation and really, so let me just jump by that because I doubt any of you guys are going to use Relay, and this is the why. One thing is, it's easier to test. It's all the same stuff that you do with React Transmit. The only other benefit is it's GraphQL, which is great. The only cons is Relay doesn't have the community adoption. So if you're using GraphQL, most likely you probably don't want to use Relay, even though it's a Facebook-backed project and it's internal to Facebook. No one outside of Facebook's really using it. And most people who have started using Relay have jumped to Apollo, which is the next one. So I wanted to put this there because it's good to know what Relay is, but you should probably use Apollo if you want to use it.
You're talking about queries. Do you also does not provide for mutations as well?
Whoa, what did you say?
Does it not also provide for mutations as well as queries?
Yeah, it does, but
Okay, you were just showing one. Okay.
yeah, so I'm only actually managing a data flow inward. I'm actually not going to talk anything about posting, but in GraphQL you do mutations. So any post request that you would normally do in a REST API, it's called a mutation, and instead of putting the keyword query first, so right here I have query. With the Relay library, you don't have to actually say query specifically because it already knows you're doing that. But instead, you'd say mutate instead. So that's the difference. You're mutating the data. So Apollo. That's what it looks like. It's very similar to Relay. You inject it very similarly. You do that very similarly. The API is quite different where it's not like you're not creating containers, but you're actually creating Relay queries. They're same thing, HOCs, very similar, enhanced components. And pros. Has anybody used Apollo yet? Cool. Definitely go that route. There's actually the Apollo team came out of Meteor, and they host the GraphQL meetup in SF. So if you're interested in learning some cutting edge technology, I highly recommend you check out Apollo. It's same benefits, same cons as Relay. The only other con is it actually is supported. They just had a contributor week last week where people were contributing to Apollo, the framework, directly, and they just had a lot of underhand pitches of things you can commit to and projects they can do. I think out of that came Ember Apollo, came out of that too, and some other things. I think Apollo Android came out of that last week too as well. So you can use Apollo and Android directly. No React, it's Apollo. So it's actually pretty framework agnostic too. Relay is very React specific, so you can only use it for React, which should have been a con. With Apollo, you can actually use it in anything. You can use it in Angular, Vue, etc. Any of the hot JS frameworks that are out there that you guys want to try out. Cool. So check out learnapollo.org. Pretty legit. I went through it. Also, Apollo uses Redux under the hood. So if you're a big fan of Redux and you can't, but you want to use GraphQL, you can actually have your provider that passes in your store to all your components as well.
So you mess it up if you directly access it then? Because I know some places when they layer over things, it can mess up if you don't use their API to access it.
I have no idea. I've never actually used the Redux API of Apollo because again, like I spent too much time talking about why I don't use Redux on all of my side projects. So I obviously didn't use Redux for Apollo either. And that's their documentation. I was going to say something really profound there, but I forgot what it was. I don't have a note. But in summary, check out GraphQL. Use HOCs with your data flow, and also keep it simple. My whole pitch to my current company is that I just want to have one feature in a mobile app, so that way I can justify us producing a mobile app. I'll probably make it anyway because this is basically, I take most Thursdays, like I'll take half the day to do whatever I want because we're a small company and I can do that. So right now I'm building a mobile app and hopefully in the next few weeks I'll be able to tweet it out and say, hey, download this app. One thing I didn't mention, and I kind of had it in the notes, or in the actual code, is that GraphQL is a backend as a service. So if you don't want to use, like if you're building a side project and you want to try out GraphQL, check out GraphQL because it's like Firebase but for GraphQL. So if you guys ever use Firebase, if you haven't, and maybe check out Firebase too. But with that being said, I also want to mention I'm doing an Intro to React course, but there's actually an Intro to React Native course workshop at Reactathon, which is coming up next month. So highly recommend checking it out. I think the early bird pricing is cutting off at the end of the month. So you should check that out and register now if you really want to go to it. Questions?
You mentioned a new library for navigation that you started.
Yeah, that library is called React Navigation. I think it like showed up on somewhere about like 2 weeks ago. Hacker News, probably Hacker News. But they're basically all the problems with like React Native. So like the one project I still have maintained that I did for my last company I worked for, we use Navigator iOS, which is well deprecated. And I don't work there anymore, so I'm not upgrading it, but it's like open source project. I've tried React Native Navigation. There's also React Native Experimental, which came out, which was kind of hot for like a week. But at this point, I think everybody's pushing everybody towards React Navigation because it's community supported and not Facebook supported. So you can kind of inject your thoughts and ideas into that. So check out React Navigation. I've only brushed the surface of it so far. Like I have it installed in my app, but like you saw, I only have one page right now. So until I get that second page, I haven't really used it. I also wanted to show GraphQL real quick. So what's cool about GraphQL is it's a query-based language. Man, that is cool. So I can write my query and I can get data. So that's what that does. And now the internet. Okay, so this is like another side project I built to manage like a CRM tool for open source projects. I just make notes on it. And if I wanted to get back data based on all the projects in my GraphQL database, I get all that data here. So this is just a JSON blob. If you can't see in the back, this obviously is not 1996 friendly. I'm not sure why this screen is so weird. But so right now these are GitHub repositories. We've got a name, you've got a URL that's showing up on the right. If I wanted to adjust this query in my code, and I wanted to see how many stars show for each repository that I'm watching, all I do is update the query with the column name, and then now I have stars, which GitHub calls them stargazers. So that's the gist of it, and I can populate other queries to get like the first 10 things that match that description. So super nice. It's nice to do that sort of querying in your GraphQL, and you only have one endpoint to hit too, so you don't have to so if I'm going to my sites screen and going to my deploy screen, I hit the same endpoint, which is this GraphQL endpoint, which is super nice.
One of the things I also point to people is the fact you don't have to stop versioning your APIs anymore because of this.
Yeah, you don't have to version an API because you can just add and remove things and everything still works. GitHub, actually, so Bianca, I mentioned I did Jamstack Radio, which is a podcast on the Jamstack, et cetera, et cetera. It's about JavaScript. I had the GitHub guy, Kyle Daigle, on there talk about their conversion from REST to GraphQL. It's a conversion, but not everything's available in the GraphQL API.
Right.
So they're slowly adding more and more stuff to it, but they don't have to the version that's out today is not version 1. Like it's just the GraphQL API. So they don't have to version everything week by week or whatever it is, whenever they decide to make a new version. Cool. Yeah, slides are at uses.netlify.com. You can find me on Twitter at BWYo. Thanks.